my name is PaulRaines. As Val said, I'm the Chief Information Security Officer for the United Nations Development Program. A little bit about my background. I graduated from the Air Force Academy, and while I was in the military, I controlled nuclear missiles and satellites. Then I went to grad school, and after I got out of grad school, I was Director of Electronic Commerce for the U.S. Postal Service. Then I took my first job as a CISO with the Federal Reserve, and I was with the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, also with Barclays, also with Bloomberg, and then now with the United Nations. Okay, so that's my background. I'm going to, since it's a mentorship program, I'm going to talk a little bit about what I think is important that you should know if you work as a CISO or in information security in general. And then we'll kind of focus in on the COVID-19 response and that crisis. Okay, if you're going to work in information security or cybersecurity, as they say, you need to know about ants and elephants. Okay, what do I mean by ants and elephants? Ants are the little things in your work life that come across your desk every day. And they're things like, patching a security vulnerability, answering an audit write-up, people reporting an incident to you, and you have to, it may not be an important incident, it may just be a phishing email, but you have to respond to it. And those ants, as soon as they come across your desk, you have to smack them right away. Because if you don't smack them right away, those ants have a tendency to multiply. Anyone who's been on a picnic knows that that's the case. And those ants will get all over you and they will eat you alive, and everyone will be coming to you and saying, when are you going to answer whatever? Or I see that you didn't patch that security vulnerability and now it's been exploited and now it's taken over, our network. Or, it's any of a number of things that can happen. But when you see these small things, you've got to smack them right away, get them off your desk, take care of them. And then you'll also find in your career, there are things called elephants. Now, what I mean by elephants are the really big things that an elephant, when it comes across your desk, it can lift up one of its big paws and it can just crush you. And they're things like your CEO calls you with a question about cybersecurity, or you have to go before the executive board to give a briefing on your cybersecurity program and what the major risks to the organizations are. Or there's a major crisis that happens and everyone's looking to you for the answers and to manage that crisis. So I've seen a number of these crises in my career. One of them was 9/11. Another was the power outage in New York that lasted for more than 48 hours. COVID-19 certainly falls in that category as well. So I've seen a lot of different crises. And when there's a crisis, the people of the organization, especially the senior management, they don't really know that much about cybersecurity. They know it's complicated, and they know that they've got you handling it. And so they're relying on your judgment and what needs to be done. And so they're looking for you for leadership. And one of the easiest ways to screw up a crisis in your career is if you aren't there or you haven't been prepared and the crisis spirals out of control. So in this particular crisis, the COVID-19 crisis, I'm going to talk about some of the things that I think will help you in managing this particular kind of elephant. And I'll try to draw on some experiences on some of the other crises I've handled as well. So I would think, the one probably most important rule in handling a crisis is to be prepared for it. So you might say, well, how can I be prepared for a crisis if I don't know what the crisis is going to be? Well, that's why we have something called business continuity planning and disaster recovery planning. And I happen to be in charge of both. In addition to cybersecurity, I do the business continuity planning and the disaster recovery planning. So in those instances, the difference between the two is business continuity looks at how you continue the business. So it'll answer questions like, you know, if the head of an organization is taken out of action for whatever reason, maybe they're on vacation, maybe they were injured by the crises, then you have a chain of command, and you know how to get in touch with everyone. You know what your critical applications are. So you have all that set out in a business continuity plan. Disaster recovery is more technical in nature, and it looks more at if you had your information systems that were suddenly destroyed by, say, a natural disaster or a man-made disaster, then how would you recover from that? And so that looks at more like how much information do I need to recover? How quickly can I recover? So they're called like recovery point objective and recovery time objective. And it would, you know, have things like, you know, where am I going to get the software to reconstitute systems? If I have a backup site, is it a hot backup? Is it a warm backup? Is it a cold backup? And so each one of these things have to be planned in advance, and lots of consultations with your business owners to make sure that you've got a recovery plan that's going to meet their objectives and keep the business running. Okay. So that's one thing, is to prepare. Now, in this particular COVID-19, this has actually been one of the easier crises that I've been through because I did have time to prepare. I had the reports that were coming in primarily from Asia that said that this is a pandemic that's starting. It's going to be very deadly. And so we went through our business continuity plans. We had a tabletop exercise where we went through it with all of the business leaders in UNDP. And we had added to that business continuity plan. We went back in the past where we were handling the SARS epidemic, and we got out our plans for handling a pandemic, brushed them up to make sure that they were relevant to this pandemic. And we added that to our business continuity plan, and then we went through a tabletop exercise. So when this thing happened, I felt that we were very prepared. We knew what to expect. And it just comes from simple preparation. Okay. Second thing I would advise is make sure you follow fundamentals. Okay. I think that in cybersecurity, whenever there's something bad that happens, 99 times out of 100, you can trace it to a breakdown in fundamentals. Now, I'll grant you that every now and again, there will be something called a zero-day vulnerability, that no one has ever heard of this vulnerability. It just starts exploiting, you know, as soon as it's discovered, and then you're trying to scramble to get back from behind. I've only seen a handful of these zero-day vulnerabilities in my entire career, which has spanned 23 years. So I've had it happen to me, you know, where a zero-day vulnerability was exploited. And I've had to try to scramble when I heard on the industry that there were zero-day vulnerabilities that were being exploited. So that happens, but most of the other 99 out of 100 events you can take care of by following best practices. So in our case, we follow a international standard called ISO 27001. And under ISO 27001, it has I think it's 109 different types of controls that you have to implement in your organization. And we have an auditor from Lloyd's of London that comes and inspects us once a year to make sure we're following this standard and maintaining that certification. So the reason why that's important is if something happens, you want to be able to report to your senior management that you are following industry best practices, and you've been able to either limit the damage or quickly respond to the incident, whatever it was, and you were able to nip it in the bud. So that's a second thing. So the first one was try to prepare as much as possible. and test your preparation. And the second is follow best practices. A third thing in a crisis is, I would say, be flexible and responsive to your clients. In this particular crisis, there were two things that came up that we had to quickly handle, and I had to become an expert on. One of them was Zoom, what we're using now. We didn't use Zoom as a teleconferencing platform. We were primarily Skype for Business and Skype for Teams. But it turns out that a lot of our clients were complaining because in low bandwidth areas, particularly in our offices in Africa, they were saying that Skype for Business wasn't working for them. And they were demanding that we go to Zoom. Okay, so early back in February, we negotiated a enterprise license for Zoom, and I had to do a due diligence on Zoom and say, okay, this is ready to become a enterprise application. Okay, you know as well as I that suddenly all of these articles came out in the press about security vulnerabilities in Zoom. I personally think, even though those vulnerabilities might have been there, they were certainly brought out in the open right away when Zoom saw its increase in usage go up by 20 times what it was before the COVID crisis. So all these economic competitors of Zoom were suddenly having security researchers doing a lot of research on Zoom and then releasing those vulnerabilities as soon as they found them, rather than which is typically the practice in the industry, is the security researcher will tell the manufacturer and give them a grace period, usually about 30 days before they release something in the wild. So as the CISO, you're suddenly the expert on Zoom, and everyone's looking to you in the management to secure Zoom. So we had to do a lot of scrambling with each announced security vulnerability. One, you're having to explain that to your user community. Typically, I do that through these security advisories that I announce to the entire staff population. And they want to know what they should do in response to this vulnerability. And so we were having to provide guidance on configuration for Zoom meetings. We were having to take actions at a centralized corporate level to see what things that we could take out of users' hands and then just automatically implement them at the corporate level, as a universal setting. So that was something that we had to very quickly do. So that was one thing we had to respond to our clients. A second thing was we had to start using an application called DocuSign. DocuSign was an application that essentially uses electronic signatures so that you can put it on electronic documents. And they're typically used for legally binding documents such as contracts. You don't want to use it for your normal workflow in an environment because it's like $1.50 per envelope that you sign. So it can be quite expensive if you just use it for day-to-day business. But for legally binding documents, it's a good tool. So in that case, we had to scramble to get a enterprise license for that software, DocuSign, and I had to do a security review on the software. And then I had to write a corporate policy on digital and electronic signatures to say that they were allowed for the corporate environment in UNDP. So that's something that you aren't thinking about that prior to the crisis. And it's just something that came up. It was based on user demand from people being at home and a lot of senior executives needing to sign documents. And they couldn't do them from their remote location. So they needed to be able to do it electronically. So that was something else that came up. So probably the next lesson I would say, so we talked about being prepared, we talked about following fundamentals, we talked about being flexible and responsive to your clients. The next thing I would ask is always ask yourself, what am I missing? What should I be thinking about? And the reason I say that is that in any job, it's human nature to become complacent and to think, I've been a CISO for 23 years. I know it all. I've seen it all. There's nothing that's going to come up that's going to surprise me. However, with that amount of experience, I also know there's always something that's going to come up and bite you in the butt. Always, always, always. So you always have to be asking, not just yourself, ask your staff. Say, is there anything that we're missing? Is there anything we should be thinking about? Now, in this COVID crisis, I can't think of, there's some particular things that come to mind, with a crisis where you've got everyone staying at home. One of them is, or should you be sending out tips on how to keep their workspace, at home secure, not having kids working on their workstation when, they're live, for example. How do they protect that workstation? Things like that. So we put out an advisory to people about securing their home workspace. Then another thing that came out with the COVID crisis is there's been a lot of phishing attacks and scams that have come out from criminal gangs who want to exploit the crisis for commercial gain. And we've seen a lot of that in the United Nations. People wanting to set up fake websites pretending to be from the WHO or sending out email from the WHO, pretending to give advice and then saying, okay, you've got to click on this link to get the advice. And then they use that as a means of harvesting credentials, for example, their username and password. And then they, use that to try to commercialize that, to monetize that information in some way. When you have these phishing people coming in and compromising accounts, then they can either use that to, send out spam, or they can send it out to other people trying to trick them into also giving out credentials because it comes from a so-called trusted source, the compromised email account. Or sometimes they may just sit on that email account and do nothing but silently listen and read emails and see if there's something that they can monetize based on that information. So you've always got to be asking yourself, what am I missing? What are the hackers? How would they be thinking? How would they be trying to exploit this particular attack? Okay, so we've seen a lot of things that have gone on with the hackers, and you have to try to anticipate what they're going to do by continually asking that question: what should I be thinking about? Then the last point. So I've talked about 4 points to keep in mind. One is preparation. Second is follow the fundamentals. 3 is be flexible and responsive to your clients. 4 is keep asking, what am I missing? And the last thing I think would be stay calm and focused. Now, a lot of times in a crisis, there's a lot of things going on, a lot of people yelling, a lot of people wanting to contribute. And one of the things you have to do is to stay focused on what is the major problem, what's the root cause of the problem, and how can I get to that root cause and solve the problem that way. A lot of times you can be out chasing things on the periphery. If you're in a major incident, you might be saying, "Oh, I need to respond to a press release," or "I need to make sure I contact the FBI," or "I need to get legal and HR involved." Okay, that's true. You might need to do those things, but the most essential thing is to address the root cause of the incident. How did it happen, and how are you going to prevent that from happening again? Because until you get that an understanding of how the event happened and close off that vulnerability, it's only going to expand. And I'll give you an example I had from an event that happened about 10 years ago, where we had a guy, he was I guess you'd call him a world famous hacker. And the only reason he was world famous is because he had compromised the BlackBerry account of Tony Blair when he was the PM of Great Britain. And that got published in the BBC. And anyone that's worked in media, and I have at Bloomberg, you know that when an organization like the New York Times or the Beeb, whenever they publish something, all the other news organizations pick up on it because it becomes automatically, by definition, news just because one organization reported it. So we were getting a lot of press inquiries about this guy. His name was Trick. And what he had done for his next exploit after hacking Tony Blair's BlackBerry account is he went to UNDP and he found a SQL injection vulnerability, and he was able to publish some internal information. It wasn't serious, but it was things like telling an individual they had been awarded a job, something that HR would have sent out just to that individual. And when the press came to us and asked us, what happened, and we said, well, it wasn't anything serious. It was just something minor that he put out, and we've taken down that website, and we, of course, take security very seriously. Well, because Trick, his MO was to exploit and then use it for publicity. That's all he wanted, is just publicity, because it turns out Trick was an 18-year-old kid who lived in London. So he said, on a Pastebin account, he says, oh, really? And then he released a lot more internal information from a lot of different types of applications, not just a job application website. And we were scrambling. There's a lot of stuff going on. The press is asking us what's going on. We're thinking about, we've got to report this to the authorities. Our business users are becoming, alarmed. But you got to keep your eyes on the prize. We still hadn't figured out what was the attack vector that Trick used to compromise our IT environment. How did he do this? And we looked at the message that he had posted in Pastebin, when he was retaliating against us. And we noticed that there was a SQL error there. And we looked that up, and that SQL error could only have occurred if Trick had admin rights to the site. And so we did our own internal investigation. How could Trick have gotten admin rights? And it turns out the sysadmin for that site had misconfigured the site so that one site reporting to a database that housed the databases for about 40 different applications gave Trick access to that entire database of those 40 applications. And the sysadmin guy had realized his mistake and had gone back and corrected it once he realized that it had been hacked. And he was ashamed, and he came into my office crying, and he confessed to what he had done. But that led us to be able to correct the situation so that Trick could no longer continue exploiting us. And then once you have a situation under control, you can then take care of all those other things of contacting the FBI, which we did, handling the press inquiries, which we did, making sure you address the business units and letting them know that everything's okay. But it turns out, we cooperated with the FBI. Trick went to trial. He went to jail for 4 years. He got out of jail, and I'm not making this up. This is a true story. He went off and he joined ISIS, and then he was killed in a U.S. bombing attack. So that was the brief story of Trick and what happened with him. Okay, so in conclusion, we've talked about ants and elephants. When these crises come up, they're definitely elephants. The best way to handle them is 1, prepare for them. 2, follow best practices. 3, be responsive to your clients during that crisis. 4, keep asking, what am I missing? And then 5, just stay calm and focused on handling the big things and the root cause of situations. And then you'll find at the end, you will have handled the crisis, and everyone will look to you and say, yay, we're glad we got this guy as the CISO. With that, Val, I'll turn it over for any questions that people may have.
Thank you, Paul. That's as always, there is always a story. And I think this is one of those, if you have lived it, it kind of story, right, that you cannot make up. And especially in our world, we always see these nuances coming up. and especially when we have to, you know, respond to this. I think we, from your lessons that you just shared, I believe we start lasting fast first and say, stay calm and look forward to and focus eyes on the prize. So thank you, Paul, for the background and your experience, not only just living through it, but also preparing for a situation like this. And I was surprised. I have spoken with a number of CISOs and several security leaders at this time, and I'm not sure how you know, where I can pair this, but not too many people would have been so bold enough to say that we are prepared. So I'm really glad to hear that. And I believe these are the, you know, what you just outlined is the recipe for that preparation, right? So a couple of questions, and I think we'll take some, if we have time, we'll also go through some audience Q&As as well. What I was curious always is that, you know, when you go from one industry to the other, and probably nobody has done that better than you or more than you in terms of going from one sector to the other, where do you think some of the baseline preparations or fundamentals are that you take to your next job, especially in a completely different sector such as yours, coming from finance to media and several hops into a global organization?
Well, every industry has a different risk appetite. I would say, you know, I was in the military. The military has a very low risk appetite. They don't like things that have even a little bit of risk, especially in the systems I worked in, which is nuclear missiles and communication satellites. Then, you know, I worked in a government agency, the Postal Service, which they were trying to, at the time, they were trying to reinvent themselves. So I was working in electronic commerce, and we developed a new technology to replace the postage stamp meters. So we were working with people like stamps.com to embed digital signatures and encryption in their products so that people could download postage to their desktop and then print out that postage on a desktop printer. And then that would zip through the mail stream, and it would scan. It's called an indicia, but it's like a barcode that it would scan it and then would check to make sure that you weren't spending more postage than what you had downloaded. So they had a you know, a high risk appetite. And then if in financial services, you go back to low risk appetite because they don't like financial scandals. You know, there was been reports that you know, the Russians had hacked some of the major banks in New York a few years back, and you didn't hear anything about it until several years after the fact because they don't like you know, that kind of scandal getting out in the press, and then people don't put their money in your bank. And then in UNDP, we're more of a high appetite for risk. So for example, when all these, I just saw when all these Zoom vulnerabilities began to be reported, the CISOs in the UN system met, and some organizations banned Zoom outright. The organizations like IAEA and the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, because they were dealing with state secrets, you know, in terms of nuclear missile and chemical weapon declarations. So they didn't want to have anything to do with Zoom. But other people like UNDP, you know, they would release a vulnerability that said, oh, you know, instead of using 256-bit encryption, used 128-bit encryption in Zoom. And so I looked it up. I said, oh, if there were 128-bit encryption, how long would it take them to decrypt that? And it turned out it was like the mean time was 35 billion years using a supercomputer. So I look at that and I said, okay, right. So some nation state is going to use a supercomputer for 35 billion years in order to break into a Zoom conference to hear the kind of conversations that we're having. You know, it's not going to happen. So we were willing to take that risk. And so really, even though the fundamentals are the same, you put the same types of controls in place in all the organizations. A lot of it depends on the risk appetite of the organization and how how much that thing is controlled. So for example, you can authenticate with the username and password, or you can use multi-factor authentication, or you can use biometric authentication. And so depending on the organization, they'll come up with a different answer to that basic control.
Right. And it's also relative to what you're trying to get to, not across the entire organization. It's just hard, practically not possible. Right. We have time for one more question, which is basically probably in the current news question, which is when a significant third party gets breached. Right. That's been always an issue, that we take a risk-based decision who we engage, and both on the IT side and the business side, especially on the cybersecurity side. What are your thoughts when preparation towards that, and also response towards that?
Well, for preparation, we do a due diligence before we sign someone. And that due diligence typically means we look at an independent third-party audit of their controls. And I'm talking like a SOC 2 audit or a SAIE 3402 type 2 audit, where the auditor is looking at the listed controls and then they're testing them to see how effective they are. So I look at that audit report, and then we make sure that if we have any controls we need to be concerned about in the contract, we address that in the contractual provisions. And it could be, you have to think through that, because you have to think at the end of the day, if I decide to terminate my service with these people, how do I get my data back, and how long do I have to get the data back? So you have to think that through. But then once you have someone under contract, all you can do is just ask for, if they have like a certification, look at the results of the certification audit on an annual basis. If they have auditors who are coming in, ask for those audit reports and review those to make sure these guys are being diligent. And then if an actual breach happens, you actually have to see how you've been affected. Typically, in a contract, they have to notify you within a certain period, usually 24 hours, if they've suffered a security incident that affects your data. And you have to make sure that gets written into the contract. And then once the incident has been reported to you, you have to ask some very detailed questions about the extent of the breach, and then what, if anything, has happened to your data, whether it's been potentially copied or if it's been manipulated. But there's a lot of things that go into that. Of
course. All right. Paul, thank you for sharing your wealth of experience with us. It's always a pleasure to have you. I literally had a bow tie. I thought we'll get to that session where we can have 5 minutes to kind of get your master acumen in place, but probably some other day.
Okay, next time you wear a bow tie too.
But we'll be respectful to you for your time, and those that have joined. I just want to conclude thanking you. It's always a pleasure to have you. Looking forward to meeting in person very soon in New York or some other interesting place. With that, I just want to share the next week's guest, and that will be Brian Hurd from Aon. He's been a longtime friend of ours as well. And overall, we're looking to build on this knowledge base that we have had with friends such as Paul and leaders that have been influencing this industry. So thank you again. Have a good and healthy rest of the week, and stay positive, and stay calm and focused and march forward. Thank you, each and everyone. This YouTube video will be available online for those that couldn't join. So if you have any other questions, you can post there or reach out to me. I'll forward them to Paul. All right. Thank you. Have a good rest of the day.